Greetings, everyone. Liberating Crimea, the siege of Russia begins. Ukraine officially activates Phase 2, ladies and gentlemen. Is Crimea the final key to ending the prolonged war between Russia and Ukraine? Many believe reclaiming Crimea would need a bloody landing, but the reality might be quite different. A silent but brutal strategy is being carried out, without a single soldier crossing the border. Yet an entire garrison station there is rotting from within. It is certain that the Great Bridge will eventually have to fall. Crimea is the place that will determine the outcome of the war between Russia and Ukraine. In 2022, Ukrainian President Zelensky stated that Crimea is the key to ending this conflict. Regaining the peninsula is not only a military objective, but perhaps also the most ambitious aspiration of the Kiev government. Bordering the Black Sea and occupying one side of the Sea of Azov, Crimea is a vital strategic piece in the region, serving as a key point to protect lucrative maritime and trade routes. For Putin, everything began with the capture of Crimea. The ports on this peninsula not only display power in the Black Sea, but also form the logistical backbone for all Southern Front military operations. All that power originates from Crimea. In other words, Crimea is not just a strip of land, but it is the heart of Russia's southern war zone. However, in reality, the overall picture has now changed dramatically. Russia can no longer safely use any port on this peninsula. The once famous Black Sea Fleet has been forced to flee from the legendary Sevastopol base. Nevertheless, there are still airfields, air defense systems, and significant military capabilities here. If the Ukrainian army can completely isolate this peninsula, that massive supply bridge will surely be destroyed, and then Crimea will be completely cut off from the mainland. Of course, one of the most important factors that Ukraine needs to achieve this goal is sustainable funding and budgetary support. Because Ukraine has repeatedly succeeded in attacking the routes leading to Crimea, air bases, and oil depots on the peninsula, thereby pushing the Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol. Therefore, if provided with sufficient support, reclaiming Crimea is entirely feasible. This may sound like an exaggerated statement. However, retired U.S. Army General Ben Hodges affirmed this from the very beginning of the war. He even proposed specific plans to liberate Crimea. We will soon delve into these methods, but first, let's start with the most basic question. Where will the funding that Ukraine desperately needs come from? Ukraine's main funding source for the war is the European Union's €90 billion loan package. However, this aid package has been blocked by Viktor Orban for many months. However, on April 13, 2026, this obstacle disappeared overnight. The TISA party, led by Peter Magua, achieved a resounding victory in the election, and Orban had to accept defeat. The new government will fully support European Union integration and lift the veto on the €90 billion budget package. This is a crucial moment. With €60 billion allocated for military procurement and €30 billion for budget support, this aid package will serve as a lifeline for Ukraine's logistics system, especially as the attention of the United States is gradually shifting to the Middle East. With the financial issues basically resolved, now it's time to look at where this money will be spent and what Ukraine is doing in Crimea. In fact, this peninsula is systematically collapsing. The clearest symbol of Crimea's military value is the Black Sea Fleet. At the beginning of 2022, this fleet still dominated the entire Black Sea from its base in Sevastopol, raining missiles down on Ukraine's coastal regions. 3 years later, the situation is totally reversed. Through asymmetric warfare using Magurovy 35 unmanned underwater vehicles, Neptune missiles, and Storm Shadow cruise missiles, Ukraine has destroyed about 1/3 of this fleet. The remaining ships had to flee from Sevastopol to seek refuge in Novorossiysk. But even that place is no longer safe. Even in April 2026, drone attacks on the destroyers continued relentlessly. When the fleet was driven out, the military infrastructure inside Crimea was systematically dismantled. Oil transfer stations, fuel tanks, radar systems, and air defense systems were continuously attacked. The railroad ferries were destroyed. The Kerch Bridge often had to be closed due to drone alerts, forcing supplies to be rerouted through Donbass by road, where Russian troops were firing a lot but hitting very little. While Ukraine's air defense system intercepts drone attacks from afar, with a success rate of up to 95%, every target in Crimea is being destroyed one by one with precise strikes. In fact, there is a clear logic behind these seemingly random attacks. And the person who explains that logic most clearly is retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. In an exclusive interview, Ben Hodges explained in detail the process of reclaiming Crimea. This strategy is not a bloody frontal assault, but rather a systematic war of attrition. Ben Hodges' core proposal is that in order to completely collapse Crimea militarily, the peninsula must first be cut off from Russian territory. If the Ukrainians can isolate it, then that massive bridge will surely have to collapse. This isolation campaign is happening on three fronts. First, from the sea, by driving the Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol, destroying the railway ferries, and crippling maritime port traffic. Second, through the bridge, keeping the Kerch Bridge in a state of high alert, constantly disrupting traffic and causing structural damage through underwater attacks. Third, by land, the Zaporizhia-Melitopol route is under heavy pressure, while ground supply routes passing through outposts are always within the firing range of HMS and ATACMS missiles. When these three prongs of attack work together, the Crimean Peninsula will no longer be a Russian base connected to the mainland, but will become a besieged area, forced to fend for itself. Once the foundation of isolation has been established, the second wave will begin to turn this peninsula into a place that cannot be sustained militarily. The key point that Ben Hodges emphasizes is that at this stage, the goal is not to seize territory, but to make Crimea unlivable for Russian soldiers. Airfields are being systematically shut down. Saki, Belbek, and Kirovskoye are being knocked out one by one. Oil depots catch fire every month, leaving planes without fuel, warships without oil, and tanks without fuel as well. Air defense radar systems are blinded. S-400 and Panzer complexes are being crushed. Russian soldiers must constantly live under threats from above. Command centers are attacked by Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles, while ammunition depots keep exploding one after another. As a result, the Russian garrison forces are rotting from within, without a single Ukrainian soldier having to cross the border. Troop morale is dropping, logistics are failing, and the chain of command is breaking down. Ben Hodges' most profound observation lies in the third and final stage. Many people believe that retaking Crimea would require a massive frontal assault with thousands of soldiers, but Ben Hodges flatly rejects that. From a practical standpoint, if Russia can no longer use any naval bases and has had to move the Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol, even though they still have airfields and combat capabilities, if Ukraine can isolate this place, that bridge will eventually collapse. In other words, a final ground campaign would only make sense when the peninsula has completely collapsed militarily. At that point, the Russian defensive forces would no longer be a resilient army, but just a scattered and isolated group of soldiers. A frontal assault could be costly, but capturing a fortress that has already been surrounded is entirely feasible with minimal losses. This approach is completely changing the nature of modern warfare. Traditional military doctrines often state that to defeat the enemy, you must break through their defensive lines. However, Ben Hodges' strategy asserts something completely different. Disrupt the logistics supporting the enemy's defense, and it will collapse on its own. The Russian military is not a flexible force, but rather a massive, heavy structure that is extremely dependent on logistics, a legacy inherited from Soviet doctrine. Once this logistical lifeline is cut off, even the most formidable tanks, artillery, and defensive lines will become nothing more than soulless heaps of scrap metal, lacking fuel and running out of ammunition. Ukraine has perfectly identified this deadly weakness over the past 3 years, and this strategy is not just on paper, but is being carried out decisively right on the battlefield. Crimea has always been at the very top of President Zelensky's target list. Ben Hodges' strategy, while perfect in theory, requires Ukraine to have specialized weapons to make it a reality. And this list is exactly why support from the West is vital for them. Long-range precision munitions are now the top priority. The ATACMS missile, with a range of 300 kilometers, can cover every key target across the Crimean Peninsula. The Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles also play a key role, especially in attacks on the Kerch Bridge and the port of Sevastopol. This weapon's tandem warhead can penetrate even heavily fortified underground bunkers. Meanwhile, the Taurus missile, which Germany has not yet supplied, would be the ideal choice for the final strikes in the third phase. The HIMARS system is also essential to maintain constant pressure along the land corridor. The situation seems more promising on the drone front, as Ukraine's domestically produced long-range drones have been systematically attacking oil depots and airfields in Crimea. Systems like the FP-1, FP-2, and FP-5 Flamingo are carrying out thousands of flights each month. In particular, naval drones like the Magura V-5 have become the main weapon forcing the Black Sea Fleet to flee from Sevastopol. They are compact, high-speed, and low-cost, but still powerful enough to sink giant warships like destroyers. Domestically made drones like Sea Baby have also been highly effective in attacking bridges, infrastructure, and seaports. However, the Gray Eagle drones from the United States have still not been transferred. If these devices appear, Ukraine's accuracy will be taken to a whole new level. The F-16 fighter jets are also crucial for gaining control of the skies. Although the number of F-16s delivered to Ukraine is still limited, and there aren't enough trained pilots yet, but when combined with HARM anti-radiation missiles, the F-16s can suppress Russian air defense systems across Crimea. The recent attacks on the Zadar-Nebo system are the first steps in this plan. Meanwhile, the Patriot and NASAM systems work around the clock to shield Ukraine's cities and frontline infrastructure from Russian counterattacks. Having enough of these systems allows Ukraine to focus its full resources on the peninsula. In other words, for Ukraine to be able to attack Crimea, their own defense systems must also be absolutely secure. Ben Hodges' sharp assessment shows that additional attacks and the transfer of Taurus missiles from the west could complete the isolation of the peninsula by the end of this summer. If these weapons do not arrive, the campaign will be stalled. But if they do appear, the timeline will be dramatically shortened. And here, time is Russia's enemy, not Ukraine's. With each passing month, Russia's infrastructure in Crimea becomes more vulnerable. The momentum of the war is now shifting toward Ukraine, and this isn't just wishful thinking, it's based on specific indicators. Ukrainian forces are breaking through multiple sections of Russia's defensive lines on the front. At the operational level, the Russian military has proven unable to stop Ukraine's attacks on oil and gas infrastructure and the defense industry. Since February 2026, Ukraine has regained the initiative on the southern front. Counterattacks have begun in the eastern areas of Zaporizhia and Dnipro, where Russia had made the fastest advances in the last months of 2025. Meanwhile, there has been little heard from Putin as he has significantly reduced his public appearances. A bitter paradox is unfolding. While air defense stockpiles around the residences of the leadership in Moscow are increasing, the systems on the front lines are gradually running out. Because this leader is protecting his own residents more tightly than he protects the Black Sea Fleet. The 27 air defense towers at Vandai could have protected thousands of soldiers on the front lines. Ukrainian intelligence director Mr. Budanov is optimistic, noting that the Russians are now desperately seeking an escape. This assessment is extremely important because it reveals what the Ukrainian intelligence apparatus is planning regarding the direction of the war. Russia's ability to influence neighboring countries is also rapidly declining, partly because they failed in the war they themselves started, and partly because of Ukraine's retaliation. Of course, this optimism is not a given. Under the Trump administration, U.S. aid to Ukraine was still limited, placing the main burden on European countries, and most of the achievements were thanks to Ukraine's own efforts. Ukraine needs weapons, money, and persistent support to keep moving forward. But currently, a third of the Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed. Sevastopol's port is useless, the floating bridge is strained, railway tracks are damaged, and airports are collapsing. Air defense radars are being destroyed one by one, oil depots are blazing, and the €90 billion budget package from the EU will soon be dispersed. Under those conditions, what Ben Hodges described is no longer just a hypothesis, but an ongoing campaign happening hour by hour, minute by minute. As Zelensky said, the aggressor must not be allowed to receive any rewards from the war. These are not just empty slogans. Crimea belongs to Ukraine, and the world must always accept that truth. So, if Ukraine actually regains Crimea, is this just a change of ownership over a piece of land? No, its impact will extend far beyond Ukraine's borders, reshaping the entire Black Sea basin and the global geopolitical balance. The most tangible benefit for Ukraine is economic. Regaining Crimea means securing the entire southern coastline. The ports of Sevastopol, Dnipro, and Feodosia will be reintegrated into Ukraine's economy. These were the main gateways for Ukraine's grain and metal exports before the war. Maritime insurance costs in the Black Sea will decrease, trade routes will return to normal, and Ukraine's annual export revenue could increase by billions of dollars. One of the key resources for rebuilding the post-war economy is safe trade through the Black Sea. And that safety can only be fully guaranteed when Crimea is under Ukraine's control. But even more important is the energy aspect. The Black Sea continental shelf around Crimea holds huge reserves of natural gas that have been discovered but not yet exploited. Before the annexation in 2014, international energy corporations had conducted exploration here. Regaining Crimea would help Ukraine take a big step toward energy independence and also open up a new supply source for Europe as it seeks alternatives to Russian gas. This would be a game changer not only for Ukraine's energy security, but also for all of Europe. From a military perspective, regaining Crimea would completely end Russia's ability to project power in the Black Sea. The Black Sea fleet without Sevastopol would only be a small, weak force trapped in Novorossiysk. Russia's ability to threaten the southern borders of Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria would be completely eliminated. NATO's southern flank would be relieved of pressure, and the Black Sea would truly become a safe commercial zone. Romania and Bulgaria's maritime security concerns would be significantly reduced, and Turkey would be freed from pressures related to the Straits. Geopolitically, the reclamation of Crimea would send the strongest message about international order since 1945.
145.
Territories seized by violence and force can ultimately be reclaimed with honor. This strong message is not only directed at Russia, but also serves as a stern warning to China regarding its claims in the South China Sea, to the Beijing authorities eyeing Taiwan, and to all powers intending to challenge the global order. The core principle that any violation of territorial integrity must come at an extremely high price will be powerfully demonstrated by the most concrete and practical example in modern history. This precedent will strongly reinforce one of the most important cornerstones of the world order, and perhaps the most profound and painful impact will be felt right inside Russia itself. Losing Crimea will completely shatter the 12-year myth of Putin's historic victory. It deeply shakes the foundations of internal propaganda that took years to build. The once proud slogan, "Crimea is ours," will disappear overnight, only to be replaced by a bitter and harsh admission that we have truly lost Crimea. This dangerous situation will erode the legitimacy of the entire regime, empower domestic opposition groups, and cause deep rifts right at the center of Putin's power. Ben Hodges once stated that if Russia finds itself unable to export oil and gas, while also losing Crimea, the pressure on the oligarchs will become more intense than ever. And at that fateful moment, Putin's circle of loyalists will face its harshest and most genuine test ever. Once this peninsula becomes completely useless to Russia from a military perspective, Putin will be cornered and left with only two choices: come to the negotiating table or face an even more catastrophic collapse. When Crimea is reclaimed, the changes will not simply stop at the borders on the map. It will completely shift the strategic trade routes in the Black Sea, reshape energy security for all of Europe, re-establish the ironclad rules of the international order, and determine the future of Putin's regime itself. In your opinion, can Ukraine truly liberate Crimea entirely through attrition and isolation without a large-scale ground assault? And if Crimea really returns to Ukraine, what kind of Russia do you believe will emerge in the future after the collapse of the Putin myth?